And on we are, please.
Okay. So as you know, the paper is called CMS Implementing a MMORPG for Learning Programming. So I will mainly talk about the experiment they conducted because the theoretical background, well, I already covered most of it. So first of all, the sample they used. So they took students from the bioinformatics department, the University of Macedonia, where he had basic knowledge in programming concepts. And the students all followed the procedural programming course, so they all have the same background. And that's basically all we know about the students. So there was 80 students that followed this course, and so they made a questionnaire to evaluate so that the students could self-evaluate themselves and their competence in programming. And out of that, they only kept half of the students, and then they made a selection to have based on the performance in the procedural programming course and also in the questionnaire, so that they have those kind of representation in the student. And so they have mainly students that had low mid grades and low self-evaluation score, and less students that have high, medium to high grade. So in the end, that's only 22 students. It's not much actually. That's what I think. And we don't have anything else, any else information on the sample beside that. So, and that's something that didn't discuss in the paper either. So don't really know what to add about that. I think it would have been interesting to have some more insights about the overall sample. And for the study, I understand why they chose to have students with the same background, because they wanted to see if there was a relationship between the grades in the course and the performance in the game. So that makes sense, but then the result can be generalized further than that. So for the method, so they used the CMX games, and they designed the interaction with the senseis are the name of the PNG in the game, so that's why. And there is 3 levels of senseis. So the basic ones where they have basic activities to basically learn the theory about arrays in a programming environment. So they had some multiple choice questions on theory and some validation questions on syntax. Then the second level of senseis were the drag and drop activities that I showed you earlier, to learn about how to manipulate arrays, and also to learn about, and they had to reconstruct a bubble sort algorithm using the drag and drop feature. And finally, at the end of the game, for the student that went this far with the game, there was two solving problems, and that was more advanced where the student had to actually code themselves to solve the problem. So each study session lasted 1.5 hours, 1.5 hours, and they did that 2 times per student. So, and at the end of each session, the student had an online questionnaire, and with 32 questions, where they first assessed the student progress, and also there have some scale answers to know, to have information about how the players was interested in the game, how he performed, how he perceived the performance of the player, and also the evaluation about the game performance, how the student interacted in the game, how entertaining and motivating the student were, and what the student he learned about that. So that means that's the only thing they use to measure, actually, and to have to draw a conclusion upon. And the main concern I have is that it's only basically self-evaluation. That's the student that tells how he evaluates his own experience in the game, and there is no metrics in the game apart from how many puzzles they solved. That tells you how the student performed. So it's a bit limited, but it's already something.
That's an interesting, if not daunting, conclusion. So I hope none of the authors is watching us. It's something. So it's like, you know.
Yeah, I don't know how to do it.
All right. Good. No. I see your point. Your points are valid. So I don't object, in fact.
And another remark is regarding the results. What surprised me is they use 1 to 5 levels rightly scale, but they only basically divided the scale in 2 to draw the conclusion. So they basically 1 to 3 for them is negative feedback, and 4 to 5 is positive feedback. And we never know for each question which rating was the most represented and how distributed the ranking was. So as for conclusions, they only draw conclusion about how positive and negative the effects can be. And so, but according to what they know, the feedback about the game was mostly positive, and well, you can see there it's quite significant that most of the part in the game were good. So they had good feedback basically about the game. So that's what they use, but I think that they could have done better with the data analysis and stuff.
Yeah. Cool.
And also one thing that is quite cool is that they try to compare the core score and the game progress to see if there was kind of correlation. And so they concluded that there was some kind of correlation, because students with higher grades managed to solve every problem, every most difficult problem in the game, whereas some people with lower score didn't manage to get more than 1 in most cases. So they definitely said that there was a correlation, but same here, it's not that detailed. We don't really know. Well, I find this a little simple to analyze and draw conclusion upon. I don't know what you think.
I think that they do correlation, but no causation. Like the students that have a better grade in another class. Well, they succeeded. Cool.
Yeah.
And they have a better grade in the other class. That's just that they may just be better in this subject.
Yep. But what didn't they do?
They didn't have any test population. Like they did not compare the results between those that did not play the game.
Exactly. So yeah.
Another weird thing is that we know that the grade between 5 and 9, but out of how many? Like, is it 9 out of 10? Is it 9
It's
out
out
of
of
20?
10, yeah. It's out of 10.
I couldn't find it.
So the whole grading thing was a bit obscure, right? Because we
Yeah.
don't know the Macedonian grading system. Is that high? Is that low? Right? So that should be contextualized to have a comparability. How it, for example, is from an international perspective. So I had struggled with that as well. Okay, is 7 good or bad? You need to derive it from the
Even
context.
if we compare with the German system,
Yeah.
one is the best.
Exactly. It's
The
inverted.
one is the worst.
Yeah, exactly. So that wasn't quite clear. So, but I mean, at least that comes out. I was just thinking about the significance of the results, and to some extent, I'm happy they don't over report. But you think about, they have 22 students, right? 60% have grade 5, I think, right? Was it or the lower grade anyway?
Grade 6.
Yeah.
5 or 6.
5 or 6,
Yeah,
right?
5 or 6.
So if you have 22 students, that is 13.2 students, right? So how many students do you have left? Well, you have 3.5 students left, either for 7th or 8th grade. So basically, they draw all the conclusions for the higher grades based on 3 students each. And you see that in the resulting table quite clearly,
Yeah.
the one you showed, because they have reported 33%,
Yeah,
66,
36%.
or
Yeah,
100, right? So
That's
that's, if you see that, it usually means they have an oddly small sample size. Otherwise, you will never arrive at those insights. Yeah? So I'm again extending on your discussion. I'm happy they don't over-report. At least they don't make more out of it than it is.
Yeah.
But it's, in my view, total undersampling in terms of. I would be careful publishing that in the first place. In a way, I mean, there's some very tentative, but as Louis said, compared to what, right? So what does it tell me? Compared to students that didn't do it. So that's one of the aspects. Yeah. So there's definitely a sample size problem, a lot of discussion problem. What other issues did you spot? Who wants air first?
Yeah, I
Chris-
thought
yep.
the issue with they used the positive and negative thing. They didn't explain what the 5 points was. I assume it's like mostly positive or some form of that. But some of the questions didn't have a positive or negative. Like it didn't make sense to have a positive or negative. One of the questions was like how easy it was the iron sensei or something.
I see.
How the positive and
Right.
negative don't make
Yeah.
sense.
That's right. So it's
But
very
that's-
easy or very very hard, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not. That's right. Interesting. So you think the bifurcation to positive just doesn't
Yeah, and
work?
that was also one of the questions that we got like the most negative response
Right.
Yeah.
as well.
Right. Yeah.
So-
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, this graph was weird because of that.
Yeah. When the question and the answer doesn't make sense. then-
That is a very good point. In fact, you would have want to have an inverse correlation, right? Because if you have the strongest level, the golden thing, right? So, and that is rated as easy. That is negative,
Yeah.
as opposed to having the strongest being rated, as bad because it's so hard, right? So, very good point. So they got their metrics kind of wrong, right? So at least the operationalization of the metrics. I agree with you. And one thing that is, if I ask those questions, especially those questions, I want to. Perhaps I missed that spot, but I was a bit. The experimental setup was a bit obscure to me. Are they monitored or not? Right. If your teacher is in the same room with you, guess how you will answer. Right. If the teacher is not in a room with you and you're at home, right, after you have played that game and can have time to hate it a bit, then you probably answer quite differently. Right. So there's a lot of risk of compliance-based answering in a way, right? So, and how accurate are the questions in the first place, right? So it's very fuzzy. It gives a lot of leeway for interpretation anyway. So that's sometimes a bit unclear here as well. Yeah, but good point. Good point. I actually didn't think about this, but you're absolutely right. The orientation on the scale is not sensible for many of the questions in the first place. Yes.
It's not a direct critique of the paper, but more of one of the choices they've done, which is using kind of prior knowledge to the players as kind of the scaffolding for the game itself. Kind of like you don't necessarily spark learning,
Correct.
as all of the players kind of already should know what the
Yeah.
game are supposed to teach. And I also think it's kind of funny in relation to one of the metrics they had, which was that student consider the incorporation of educational games in the learning process beneficial, and then they answer the assistance of professors in teaching programming elements, 86%, meaning that 86% of the participants really like or saw the need of assistant during the game. So kind of like the game should be or give more learning and explaining elements to the tasks and theory they kind of try to teach. So kind of this might imply that their statement of kind of player prior knowledge perhaps wasn't that good, or they kind of needed some assistance.
That's a good point. Okay, yeah, the assistance aspect, so it can also be interpreted in a quite different way. That's right. I side with you on one particular thing. I think this whole paper doesn't tell me anything about learning. There's no learning there.
No.
It's pure assessment, right? So basically, take any of our B-Proc students, right? Put them into this game. You likely get an understanding of how good the programmer already is, but they will not learn anything during that game. At least there's no evidence that they would learn anything, because it's just a mapping, a correlative mapping. There's no learning. I mean, no scaffolding, no proximal development, no reflection of expertise, nothing like that. It's a pure assessment-based approach. So you can what you can do though. The only thing that I take out of it, instead of running actually exams, you let them play the game, and then you get the marks out of it. That's the only conclusion you can draw as of now, right? So for those guys, this is basically just an evaluation that this game is an evaluation tool, but it's not a learning tool. And there's two different things. If we give you an exam, you're not learning on the exam. We just evaluate you. When we give you assignments, you're learning. We give you marks, but actually we don't care. That's the opportunity for you to learn. So at the end, we know you know the stuff, right? But since you don't do anything, if you don't get marks, we give you marks anyway. So, but I'm exaggerating here anyway. But you get the gist. But this is a pure assessment tool, as far as I'm concerned as a teacher, I guess, from my perspective. So this is interesting how you can bend the perspective on using serious games seemingly for the right purpose, but actually you're measuring the wrong thing. So you're definitely not. You shouldn't use the term learning at all in there. So they should call that implementing an algorithm for assessing programming experience or proficiency, but not for learning. There's nothing of that one. So it's an interesting perspective. So, but yeah, sometimes it's good to see those papers as well, because it's interesting to debug them in various respects. I agree with you, by the way, in terms of the analysis. You want to see standard deviations, but there's little to report. I mean, come on, with those few students, if you have those weird standard deviations again of and that would be again over reporting. So, but in principle, I would agree. It would be nice to have if you had larger samples, of course, across the box and whisker charts to actually show the spread, right? So it'd be very insightful to see, because oftentimes you get more insights, and that's, I think, what you're implying is from a standard deviation as opposed to the actual metrics, right? The mean is cool, but actually, what's the spread across the mean? That is actually much more insightful and tells me something. Okay, how consistent is the gameplay, right? So if some students get a lot out of it and some get very little out of it, but you have a mean that's somewhat I don't care, that's not helpful, because that game should provide consistent improvement on that particular characteristic across all players, right? So all students, players, in this case. So I agree with you, but again, the sampling doesn't warrant it. So I was actually disappointed that they didn't use the 80 students, right? Why not just use the full 80 students? They had them there, controlled environment, and the only reason they did it, my impression was it was too much work.
Yeah.
So at least that's how they framed it, right? So at least that's what I got out of it. So anyway, so sensible exercise of exploring how different people report and how you model, but there's some kind of methodological, at least, challenges in this paper, and the motivation is slightly off. I mean, if you just see it as an assessment tool, you'll probably get away with this learning. Not sure.
But they kind of in the abstract they state that or stating the results, they're not saying anything about learning or what the initial title implies, but rather they say that people are kind of keen on using this kind of tools in learning.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's like then they shouldn't have or had that title and framed kind of the research statement in a learning fashion.
Yeah.
It should rather be kind of a proof of concept by using other tools in the classroom, rather.
The still thing that trips me, there is no learning in there. So there is no learning programming concept in there. It's just an assessment of programming skills. I think it's misleading to some extent. I agree with you, they're moderated, but usually when you select papers or look at papers, the title is important. And the title should accurately reflect what's in there, right? So, and that will be important for you in your masters as well. So sometimes it's good if you check for consistency where the title actually makes sense with the abstract. If there's an inconsistency already, that could challenge your choice for that paper, right? So one of the lessons learned.
Yeah, I don't think they're in the clear. I'm just kind of stating that, or like they shouldn't have went there in the first place, kind of.
So yeah.
And I was wondering if it would have been useful to redo the self-evaluation thing after the stuff. There was some kind of improvement.
So that would be an angle. That's a good idea. So that's the methodological fix. So they can keep their title. So, you know. But what happens if they did it and they showed lower performance?
That's what happened.
So, but that is, of course, that would be an assessment of learning then, right? So then you can see potentially if even if students didn't. There's this thing about learning. There's always generally two components. One of them is actually knowledge, and the other aspect is the metacognitive aspect, such as your confidence about how much you know, right? If you're really shit programmer, at least you should know that you're shit programmer, right? So if you're really moderate programmer, know that you're a moderate programmer. Don't think you're a good programmer, right? So that metacognitive aspect is also important in assessing if you have a challenging task ahead. If you am up to it, should I leave it to someone else, or where do I need to skill up? That's important as well in your learning, right? So not necessarily the outcome itself, but just your reflection on the outcome. That's what we ask you all the time. The whole masters will be about this. But this would be the question. There would be very helpful to assess this precisely, right? And how far your actual performance is aligned with what you think you can do. So that's quite good. Cool. Yeah. So interesting one. So it's an interesting paper. So if you find for your report another an example of good evaluation, right? So and I think you've tentatively come across that looking at your background study a bit. Use those, right? So bring those in, and I would even feel free to say you can even mostly focus on those for discussions, and discuss that with moderation or with the critique points you just introduced, because I'm kind of impressed with the material you brought into the lecture, both theoretical as well as practical. So I think it makes for a nice spread in your report of discussing both aspects and perhaps link them a bit, right? So we have the bit of theory insight, and then say, okay, I'm specifically, since you have constrained pages, looking at this particular aspect and use an example in the form of one game for this one and so on, and kind of ensure that it's kind of a bit of a coherent narrative that you have in your paper. So feel free. I think you have an abundance of sources, the way I have gauged it, and experience having played coding game yourself. So build on this, use it, right? So feel free. I think that makes for an interesting overview report, because there's a lot there. Coming back to concrete paper, a few comments on the paper itself. Other comments? Anyone? Apart from the fact that it's not a massive multiplayer online game anyway, but we got that. So we debugged that earlier. Comes back to my liking for structure.
There were things that they say and do not discuss. The fact that some players, the instances were easy or very easy, but they do not discuss why.
Right, no qualitative insights.
Yeah.
So
it's just statement.
Yeah.
Well, I think I would say that most of these papers statements.
I agree. There's limited qualitative insight, the way it looks at least, at evidence from a student side. That's right. One thing that's generally okay is the fact that have some sort of meta assessment framework. This thing here, this Venn diagram. The only thing is, and I think they're implicitly admitting that aspects are overlapping, simply by the visual representation. And that was my problem there as well. So, is there any meaning while one particular aspect on the right and one particular aspect on the left? Perhaps not. Perhaps yes. I don't know. I think they could group them cleverly into player, game, and evaluational, for example, right? So if two different sets intersect on the grounds of evaluation, they're probably better located on the right, for example, and player stuff on the left. So perhaps they did this, not clear. Would be nice to, because then you can have a meta schema that describes how the layout actually is, what it reflects, or at least in a textual description. So I was missing that a bit. What they did, however, they aligned their table, their evaluation questions, with those categories, which is good, because that even if you don't quite understand what the categories are about, the questions kind of give you an intuition as what they thought they are about, right? So that's actually not the worst of choices there. So that could rely on a bit of improvement of structure. Yes, and this thing here, the review. So they have a review of all possible programming games they have found, right? The thing that if you have a table, tell me how you order it and why you order it the way you order it, right? So first I was guessing, okay, hang on, are there structures by complexity? No, that doesn't work, because sometimes they have very primitive, like if statement with loops down there, and they have recursion as a second paper, which is a much more sophisticated concept, right? Then I thought, okay, they're probably organized it by year, so I was browsing the years. Well, that works nearly until you get to the fourth last paper, and suddenly you're back in 2006, which is before the first paper. So if you have a table, use the opportunity to structure, right? Do you structure by concept? Do you structure by year? Do you structure by alphabet? No, don't do that either. So I don't know what they're structured by. So don't think about this a bit at least, and tell that in text. Or even if you don't, it should be obvious enough to see it. Because I'm kind of, if I look at this, I want to see some structure because tables imply structure. And doing it by year would be fine as well for me, because then I see, okay, what has been the development over time, right? Perhaps you see patterns in terms of the first games mostly looked at if statements and loops, the next ones looked at more like higher level concepts or algorithmic complexity, or I don't know, right? So, or do you scaffold it by levels of skill, right? So, for example, that units of learning focus on very simple, moderate, and complex constructs. So you could have a meta structure in the table, so we have thick lines between certain aspects for the more complex ones. Or do you go by abstraction level? Do you look at operational coding as opposed to software engineering? For example, analysis of design of basic algorithms could be a very high level perspective on programming, right? Whereas like the if statements and loops are generally more very operational, right? So that's an opportunity for improvement if you think about introducing tables in your masters.
Yeah. Building on that, I also noticed that they don't reference their tables or figures in the text, except for this one, I think.
Right.
And I mean, their sections are kind of short.
That is bad.
But you should reference them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So generally by convention, you reference before first use, right? So before the table appears. Sometimes for layouting reasons, for example, you have this massive thing. Okay, if it appears below, no one will scrutinize you for that, but that's convention. Absolutely. Tables and figures need to be referenced in text, otherwise they can be effectively ignored because they're not part of the narrative. That's a very good point. Thanks for highlighting this. I admittedly didn't spot this. So, yeah. Cool. Also, what does CMX mean? Just for the sake of it. So that would be sensible, right? So to at least figure out what you know. I mean,
just
especially.
Nice name.
Huh?
Just a nice name.
Is it the last names? Is it?
No, just nice. Like.
No, it's not. So, but you know,
it might be Greek.
Right. Oh, okay.
For some reason.
Comics. But the point is, if we have acronyms, we tend to pronounce them easily. It could be, what is it, comics? Okay. But you know, you want to have a bit of a meaning connotation, so people identify to some extent as well. Because there's no way I would identify that CMX stands for an educational assessment game. Whereas, like, you know, coding game is like straightforward. Robocode maybe gives it away. So there's a lot of or Proc and Play is also quite reasonably illustrative, I guess. So a lot of these little things trip up where you feel like they could have done a better job. I think they probably spent too much time developing the editor and too little time dealing with the actual games. So
Yeah.
that could be a conclusion. Anyway, there was a few things in mind there. So yeah. Anyway. Cool. Any other comments? No? Good. You know what to do for your report? You have a rough idea? Yeah? Good. Because we're getting there, right? So it's 1st of April.
Yeah.
So you guys can start structuring that thing if you want to. I mean, ideally, do you guys know how to structure a report or have an intuition? So what's the conventional structure? I think we alluded it briefly, of papers. Think about it like a paper, right? I see it like a paper, not an essay. And it could have characteristics of a survey paper to some extent, along with practical examples, right? So that's usually how you do it. You have a general overview, you present some theory, you provide an overview of what's out there, that stuff. Because every one of you should have some sort of survey paper at hand. In some cases, a bit tricky, but in most cases, it's available. And then perhaps dive into one or two or how many permitted aspects, either by example, and discuss them later on in that paper in terms of good, bad, and ugly, right? So what's good, bad, and ugly. So what I want you guys to get out of it being kind of proficient paper reviewers in a way, right? So and summarize your insights, while at the same time writing a bit of survey paper which could correspond to your background chapter in your thesis. So you get a bit of experience doing this one, and that's where you can bring in a bit of your creativity as well in terms of what visual elements do you use for representation, how do you structure the argument, the narrative, and so on. Don't just do summary. I don't like that stuff, and that's usually doesn't make good for good survey papers. But try to find a structure of why you discuss in the order you discuss. Meta structure as a characteristic. So fundamentally, structuring wise, you have of course the abstract, which you generally write last because then you know best what's in your paper. Then you have some sort of introduction, which includes the motivation. So why you're doing what you're doing and what you're doing in the first place. Briefly introduce the structure of, in the last paragraph, usually the structure of the paper itself. The following session will describe and the next question will, and so on. And then you will have this background or related work section. So some people do it at the end, but I think in this case, since it's so centered around literature, doing the related work / background chapter or review chapter or whatever you want to call it, I give you some freedom in naming them, of course. Would focus on what's out there. So in some cases you need to dig deeper into theory. So for example, cognitive ability, you need to look at a bit of psychological theories and stuff like that. Game metrics, similar. Perhaps there's groups of metrics that need to be discussed, more player-centric, more game-centric, and whatever else, and how they're perhaps linked to cognitive abilities as well. And then you can provide, you get from more high level to more lower level in a sense that give an overview of what has been used where, right? So you're not quite discussing the operationalization, but you provide an overview how, for example, different cognitive abilities have been used in different games. That kind of overview stuff. So you're actually getting closer to the games perspective, the serious games perspective. And this way you can introduce structure, right? So where you structure the overview of what you have seen a bit more, and then use selected aspects. You will not be able to go through all your, K number of intelligence they have identified in your lecture. I recall 11 standard tests and so on. But if you find that a game uses certain characteristics, pick a game that selectively uses it and link it back, of course, which aspects of your theoretical backing you actually discussed. So it's always important to draw that link back, right? So because I need to know why did I waste my time reading section 2 if I'm in chapter 4 reading about a specific games, because they need to tell me, oh, you needed to know this, right, in order to understand what this game actually does. So think about cross-referencing. That's a good way of doing it. LaTeX, of course, is very nice at that, right? So you can use the ref abilities, exploit that. Use figures for structuring and so on. So you can discuss examples, and then you can do a bit of an evaluation in more specifically, saying, for example, why is this paper contribution good, bad, or ugly? And then you can more generally also look at what's your impression of how the field uses, for example, game metrics, or how it accurately addresses cognitive abilities, or how it actually addresses assessment as opposed to learning, right? So that was an interesting question for you to identify, because in some cases, we had just an example of just an assessment game, it may be a category, but it just needs to be categorized accurately. And some of them may just foster learning, but actually not focus on assessment, right? They just drive you doing this assembly thing, but you don't necessarily get a meaningful score or feedback, right? So which would drive learning, but the outcome doesn't matter as long as you feel comfortable doing and had fun doing it, right? So perhaps you see that kind of structure across all those different games. So it's kind of a more meta level with respect to the alignment. What real world objective are they aligned with, right? Of course, that boils down to learning if statement in the loop is fun, but that's not necessarily the kind of that is the obvious learning outcome specific to that game. But what does it actually improve, right? So from a pedagogical viewpoint, that's something you could bring in. That's not discussed there, for example, right? So, but you may see those patterns if you have a bit of a bigger overview. So think about it like a bit of boat kind of approach, right? So big picture, what I'm doing this, general theory, digging deeper, intermediate level, how to link some of the theories to CRM games or classes of serious games, do specific serious games and or discussions perhaps of specific artifacts, metrics, cognitive abilities, blah, blah, blah. Discuss them good, bad, ugly. Draw conclusions about specific aspects, specific examples you're discussing, bring it back to higher level, looking at the field in its entirety and assessing this one, drawing conclusion. Conclusion and introduction need to be somewhat aligned, right? So they make sense because if I ask a question in the introduction, I want to see kind of the answer or not in the conclusion, right? And perhaps you can even go as bold as to say the field, what's the limitations in the field, right? What could be improved in the field, right? So they should more look at this particular aspect, right? So, or this is, I feel, is neglected because the theory often provides you a good overview, and based on the implementation, you find gaps or aspects that haven't been covered, that are available in the theory but haven't been covered, for example, in serious games, right? For example, I don't know, functional programming, right? No one does that, right? So everyone looks at object-oriented programming. I don't know, right? So there's recursion there, so that's not true. But I'm just saying that could be, or at least a weaker representation there that you could discuss. So link it basically back, and then once you're done with everything, write your abstract. Right? So because the abstract then should have a clear picture of the entire paper and make it very concise, and the abstract should of course report results as well in an abstract form, right? An abstract is not just a summary of the introduction. Sometimes people do that, right? So bear that in mind. So that's what my angle. I hope that gives you a bit of a pointer as to how you could attack it. I give you freedom to kind of approach it your way. But that's the kind of structure in mind, right? So you may come up with a better structure, go for it, absolutely. So if you want to do a bit of a freestyle, yeah. I mean, it's part also exploration here. Plus, you get feedback, right? So I mean, look at this, and so if you just want to have a shot in the dark, go for it as well. Then I'm most likely driving in that direction, but it still doesn't mean that you need to adopt this. Any comments, questions? It was a very brief how to hack survey papers discussion. So especially if you do reviews though, which you probably may not necessarily have the time to, so of course there's the pathway of doing systematic literature reviews. I don't think that there's space for necessarily doing this. In some cases maybe, but I think it's too big, it will explode. But you can also have a bit of a message section on how you chose papers in the first place. Right. So, for example, I use your example all the time because it's so general. Cognitive abilities, you have the 5 different types of intelligence on, and you want to representatively cover all of them. That was your basis for choosing specific, for clustering papers that you actually found or something like this, right? So some structure that helps you organize it, right? So, and sometimes if you really want to just describe, another avenue would be, I want to discuss the progression of, for example, the use of technology in serious games in a chronological fashion to explore trends, right? So in your case, then it would be chronological discussion of what has been out there, what's the tech used, which game used it, and then discuss it, right? So that for tech could be sensible because there are a lot of trends that sit alongside the serious games that needs to be corresponded to, right? So VR, AR, and all that kind of jazz. Emergence of mobile games suddenly, they were there, and then they kind of went down again a bit and stuff. So web-based as opposed to desktop, and, so if you see those patterns, so it really depends on the kind of subject you had. But if you kind of have some dimension you want to orient yourself along for a narrative, that is probably helpful. So, cool. Well, thank you very much. Yeah. Louis next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a paper on Pokemon Go.
Pokemon Go. Cool.
Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting.
And the effect
Remind me
on
of your topic again. Your
health
meta.
and, well, health and
Health. Okay. Yes. Okay.
here it's not sales games in itself because the impact of Pokemon Go on health. So I don't know.
Yeah, but yeah,
Either
that's
way, it
interesting.
works.
Just send me a paper and have a look. But it should work because you could target the gap of alignment there.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's basically what's written. Well,
Right. But that's perfect. I mean, it can be again, serious games about meeting a primary objective by obscuring it by a secondary objective of having fun, right? So if Pokemon Go elicits fun and it's not modeled as a serious game, but it turns out to be a serious game,
Yeah.
even better, right? Because if it's aligned with the objective, even though it's not intended to, who cares? Yeah. So that's why I'm saying, yeah, if you see that pattern there, yeah, sure, of course. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you can make game is always subject to the observer, right? And what's serious and works for one person may not work for another person. But if a game unintentionally becomes a serious game, even better, right? So yeah, sounds good. Just send me the paper so I have a skim, just to get a feel. But that sounds interesting direction, and I think it would be engaging for the audience. So, cool, sounds good.